Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of our webinar this morning is exploring the schools bill, that's the 2022 schools bill, of course, and what the implications are of that bill for us in governance. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. If you'd like to ask any questions or make any comments as we go through, we welcome that. We've got a large number of people on the session this morning, so please do use the Q&A box. We will try and answer as many of them as we possibly can. If we don't manage to answer them individually and actually reference you, please don't be offended. What we'll do is try and group them together under themes. But if there are any questions at the end of the session which we haven't answered, we will actually get back to you individually if that's okay. My name is Steve Barker, and together with my colleague Linda Waghorn, who's on the other line, we're from Better Governor, and we're delighted to be partnering with Governors for Schools today to share our thoughts on the schools bill with you. But as I say, this is absolutely your session, so please, if you have any comments or questions at any time, do use the question panel, and we'll do our level best to be able to respond to them. So with no more ado, we'll actually get into the session itself. The aims that Linda and I have actually put together for this morning's session are firstly to explore in a little bit of detail what the 2022 schools bill actually says and what it means in terms of a timeline for its passage through Parliament until it ultimately receives royal assent. There are 5 key parts to the bill, and they are called parts, or you can call them sections or chapters, but officially they're called parts of the bill, and we'll be looking at those, some in a little bit more detail than others, but specifically focusing on those that we believe have the greatest implications for schools generally, but obviously school governance specifically. And as we go through the session, what we will try and do is focus on some of the attention that the bill has actually attracted so far. It's not without a little bit of controversy, it has to be said, but we'll also think about what the next steps might be in the process as well. So with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's actually going to talk you through the first few slides.
Thank you, Steve. So first of all, I think it's helpful to have an understanding of how we get to a set of a new Act of Parliament for putting the government's governmental policy for education into place in schools. So it doesn't happen overnight. And we started off and we did a Governors for Schools session, and you may have joined us at that earlier session around the introduction of the schools the white paper for school that set out that general direction. So that isn't law at that stage. It is a white paper saying this is what we intend to do. And that was called Opportunity for All, Strong Schools with Great Teachers for Your Child. So very much aimed at parents, but it was the first point at which we had that message that there would be the government's intention was that there would be a change to all schools being within an academy family of schools. So that was that first notion. This is our intention. That is then followed up by a bill, and we have the schools bill, which is the subject of our session this morning. And we're going to take you through some of the key areas of that, as Steve has suggested. And then the final stage of that, and I'll explain on the next slide exactly how we progress through this schools bill stage. The final stage of that is the government's intention is to have an Act of Parliament that will then be legally binding and will be fully fleshed out with exactly what those intentions are to do and the timeline that sits alongside that. So in a little bit more detail, looking at that centre section of that journey, so looking at the progress of the schools bill itself, we had the white paper that was published on the 28th of March. And then because this was introduced by a member of the House of Lords, Baroness Barron, we have the first reading of the draft bill, which is going to set out in a little bit more detail what the government's intentions are. First stage and second stage readings have taken place. Second stage reading 11th of May, and then it moves through something called the committee stage. So their next meeting is next Monday, the 20th of June. And at that stage, there are two more processes to go through, the report writing stage and then a third reading before it then passes to the House of Commons. And again, there's a similar process through the House of Commons with those 5 stages, 3 readings, a committee stage and a report stage. And then finally, a consolidation of any amendments that have been proposed. And that final paper is then considered for royal assent, which is the process by which it comes into being an Act of Parliament. There are some indications in the various papers that we're going to refer to of some timelines that they would like to align to, but this is the process by which the government's intentions become the law of the land, if you like. So let's think in a little bit more detail about what the schools bill is. It's not our language, long title. This is actually in the schools bill itself. So we've got that opportunity for all strong schools with great teachers for your child. But the long title, the full title, if you like, is very clear that it has separate elements. So to make provision for the regulation of academies, about school local education funding, so how schools are funded at school level, about the attendance of children at school, about the regulation of independent educational institutions, and about teacher misconduct, all for what they're calling, the term they're using is connected purposes. So you can see that there are key elements there that are highlighted in that long title. And whilst, as we say, the white paper itself was written very much in the language of parents, this bill is much more in that governmental language and therefore has a lot more depth in it. But because of that, it also has the need for being supported by a little bit more detail. I'm not saying it's the full detail because it absolutely isn't at this stage, but for accompanying the schools bill itself, the policy statement, which is a separate document, there are a number of other documents, and they're calling them bill fact sheets, although sometimes they are not in fact based on research. We've seen an awful lot of provision coming into our schools and expectations for governors. If we think about the role that we played in when we approved the pupil premium strategy in the autumn of last term, we were required, part of our expectations as governors was to ask those questions and ensure that the school had used research to inform their strategy, so the sharing of good practice, and where a lot of the progress of improving schools is based on research of what works and therefore use what works. This is a different document and accompanying documents completely. This is based on the government's policy of ensuring that all schools have a consistent standard, and a lot of these documents actually support the government's position towards their policy. And you can see there is a range of 16 policy statements, and they align to those 5 main aims that was contained in the long title. There is not a suggestion that any governor reads all of these documents, but you may identify strongly with some of these titles. So attendance might be something that you're very much interested in and aligned to in the structure of your particular board. You may have a particular interest in finance, and so there may be some of these documents that you think, actually, I might like to have a little bit more information about, and therefore they are all publicly available, easily found. We've given you a link at the end of the handouts, and please feel free to read those at your leisure. We're not going to dip into every one of these 16 documents, you'll be very glad to hear, but I think it's useful to understand that surrounding this bill, there is a little bit more detail contained against each of these subjects. So let's go back to that long title and let's think about how that supports the structure of the bill itself. A 5-part bill, as Steve mentioned, the language they use is 5-part, 5 chapters, 5 themes. As long as we understand that that's what we're talking about, and they pull out those strands in that long title. And they are all accompanied by a fact sheet or a number of fact sheets that give you greater detail. So the first is academies, and I would imagine that for most of you attending this webinar today, this is something that has been the driver about understanding what the government's message is and how it might apply to your particular circumstances. So you might be a governor in a school that is maintained by the local authority, you might be a trustee in an academy, or you might be a member of a local board at a local level within a multi-academy trust. So there will be a difference of understanding, and there will be a need to unpick some of that in terms of your own governance. And this is future plan. So just keep in mind as we go through, there is a process by which all of this has to come in place, and the proposals take us right up to 2030. So it's about understanding, developing our own knowledge, and then understanding how it applies to our school. So no rush here. This is the first part of that information. Alongside the academies element here in this bill is a need to try and look at local education funding again. Most of the bill is about a standardization, bringing into line, having a better system that is more widely understood and more widely applied. We'll say more about each of these areas. School attendance will feature in all of our governance at the moment, particularly following the pandemic. The need to ensure that all pupils are in school and getting an education. And those are the 2 themes that are the strands of that particular part. And then they'll, alongside all of this, around attendance and where children are educated and where they attend school or where they get their education from, there is also a need to understand other independent educational institutions that may be providing or supporting the provision of education, particularly when we think about homeschool education. And then again, thinking that there are a number of things around teaching and a wider group of individual organisations in that, the extension of teacher misconduct across a wider group of educational organisations. So let's look at that first part in a little bit more detail, the academies part, and think about what it is that the bill is aiming to do. And Steve will talk a little bit more about standards in the next few slides, but there is an introduction of a standard. And this has come from a whole range of different approaches, a range of different existing funding agreements, and all of the way in which academies work at the moment is a very contractual based system. So what the aim of this new bill is to move away from an entirely contractually based system, but introduce more scrutiny, because I think we will all agree that our role as governors is about ensuring that we get every child in our school in front of a good teacher, receiving a good standard of education every day. Now that's for our school. The government's role is thinking about every child, and we've got a variety of different types of organisations providing education, and within the academy system itself, a variety of different types of funding arrangements that have existed since 2014. So the aim here is to try and get a single overarching statutory framework for all schools that are state funded, and the aim here is that it's entirely trust-led, and the framework will be called an academy trust system. So this is about the introduction of that, and alongside that standardization, bringing everybody into line with what they're saying is the existing expectation. So everybody will be at the same level with the same expectations. There are new powers to the Secretary of State, including some powers on governance, that are aimed to ensure that all children are in front of a good teacher every day. And where that isn't happening at the moment, to remedy that situation as soon as possible. So at the moment, it takes a very long time for interventions in academies that are not providing good standards to remedy that situation and restore that good quality to those individual schools. It's also introducing a must for trust boards to have regard to this new legislation. And there are compliance directions, so that more power to the Secretary of State to intervene, including the power to issue a notice to improve, which replaces the financial notice to improve. And again, this is about shortening that period of time, whereas an academy trust is not providing that high standard of education.
And I think it's probably just worth, sorry to interrupt, Linda, I think it's probably just worth adding onto that any academy trust that exists at the moment and has existed since 2010 will have a funding agreement. And most of those funding agreements have a statement, I think it may even be on the first page, that says academy trusts should have regard to legislation. So again, the significance of the must is actually I think quite heavy here, and that has implications because the compliance directions and the notices to improve are basically giving the department, in the name of the Secretary of State, of course, those intervention powers which they don't necessarily have at the moment. As Linda says, they'll be able to actually impose those on a lot shorter timeline.
And I think it's important that we see those two things alongside each other, that there's a standardization but also more scrutiny. So it's a different process. This is all publicly funded schools in England. So we're looking at changing this so that all schools come under the same set of standards. But because all schools will be under that same set of standards, there needs to be a way of ensuring that those that don't meet those standards have intervention systems in place by the Secretary of State that enable that process to happen quickly. So some of this work will already be going on, but under a should and with a longer time frame. So this is all about trying to bring standards up across the whole country. There is no mention in the bill of the sort of levelling up agenda being part of what this expectation is, so there's all schools, no matter where they are and no matter which community they serve. And then finally, there are some other expectations around schools that around the delivery of religious education and collective worship as part of that curriculum. So there's a particular part of the fact sheet here that deals with curriculum and with expectations, again, bringing things into line and having the same expectations for all schools, because all schools will under this bill be academy led.
Okay, just before we move on, Linda, there are a couple of questions on the panel already from governors asking about where is the compulsory academisation of all other schools by 2030 in the bill. The simple answer is it's not part of the bill, and the government's intention, I don't think, was ever for them to legislate specifically for that. We're going to come on and talk about local authority powers in just a few moments, but the intention for all schools to become academies, or as Linda said, part of a strong multi-academy trust is the wording that the government uses, is purely government desire, shall we say, and it's nothing more than that. So there is no specific legislation for that, although you will see that when we come on to talk about the powers of local authorities, there are implications as far as that's concerned.
So if we move on to the next area, I think it is exactly what Steve is talking about. And at this point, I'll hand over to Steve, because we're now going to start talking about how the detail of each of those different fact sheet and the 5 elements of the standards, if you like.
Lovely, thanks, Linda. Yeah, and absolutely, it is the last of the provisions in the bill does actually relate to the new powers that are actually going to be conferred on local authorities to apply for an academy order. And that's just the language that the government uses. An academy order historically has actually been made by the Secretary of State, and they have actually been pushed through what were previously called the Regional Schools Commissioners' offices. They're now the regional directors of the Department for Education. And now, rather than individual schools or groups of schools applying for academy orders, they can actually come from local authorities. And local authorities, those of you that perhaps have been governors for some time or observers of the system may be very aware, local authorities were prohibited specifically from getting involved in the creation of academies when the original 2010 Academies Act was actually passed. So what this bill in its draft stage is actually proposing is an amendment to the Academies Act of 2010 by inserting a new section in, it'll be section 3A is the proposal at the moment, that does give local authorities in certain circumstances the ability to be able to create academies of their own or to facilitate academies of their own. And again, there is a fact sheet on this, which if you're particularly interested, and I'm sure some of you will be in this, you may want to refer to this. And as Linda said, the link for these is on the penultimate slide. Now, in the fact sheet itself, it reiterates the intention from the white paper. And in fact, I can read it very briefly to you. So the school's white paper set out the intention for all children to benefit from being taught in a family of schools with their school in a strong multi-academy trust by 2030. So the intention is still there, but then goes on to say that this measure enables local authorities to plan and coordinate the move of some or all of the maintained schools in their area into strong multi-academy trusts. So you'll see that there isn't compulsion there, and I can see 1 or 2 people commenting on the question panel at the moment that their local authorities investigating the option. And I think we will see that happening up and down the country. There will be some local authorities, and I'll explain why I say some in just a moment, but there will be some local authorities who will want to look at what the options are, will want to think about the proportion of schools in their areas. There are some local authorities where the vast majority of schools are already in multi-academy trusts or in standalone trusts. There are other authorities where the proportion of academisation is significantly below the national average. So there's huge national variation here at the moment. And because of that national variation, and the reason why I say some local authorities want to look at it, some local authorities have all but withdrawn from that whole arena of school improvement, support for governance, support for schools generally outside of their statutory remit, which of course is about corporate parenting, safeguarding, health and safety and things like that. So not all local authorities will be in a position in terms of expertise, staff to be deployed to actually work on these sort of projects as others might be. And I think there will be, because 2030 is still a long time away, there will be a whole variety of different approaches taken to this.
I think it's worth mentioning, Steve, here that in the fact sheet it does talk about local authorities' engagement with local partners and their plans for schools to join trusts. So there is a need for local authorities to think and plan for that where they are able to, given what you've just said, of course. And it does include a consultation process with of course, governing bodies and schools, that's included in that local authority plan, and that kind of consent for that. So there is a process. It's not going to happen overnight because it's 2030, as you've said, but there is also, although local authorities, and there's been a couple of comments on the question panel suggesting that their local authorities are actively looking at plans. And I know in my local authority area, we have had a message from the director saying that they are looking at this, and it will be a careful and proportionate approach. I think there is a little bit of nervousness around governing boards, or particularly primary schools in maintained school areas, where they're fearful that this may be imposed on them without time frame for consideration and consultation.
And I think it's important, again, obviously we have a Conservative government at this moment in time. Conservative governments like to keep reiterating to us that they're the party of choice and freedom, etc. And interesting, one of the comments that is made at the end of this fact sheet is that not all schools will have to go. So if, as Linda says, there's a consultation element to this, but schools will continue to have the right to apply to convert individually. Now, that still has to go through the regional directors, formerly regional schools commissioners. But I think we have to put this into context that we've known for some time, even before the white paper, that this was the government's intention to have a schools system which was not predicated on a local authority model. And I think you have to be very clear that the role of a local authority here is about facilitating academisation. Once those academies are actually created, there is not a great deal of clarity at the moment as the role that the local authority will actually play in the running of them. And I think what we have to think here is that it may well be, and I think what the government has envisaged, is local authorities facilitating conversations either with existing multi-academy trusts in their authority, or with potential partners outside who might come in and have those conversations. And I think, again, just putting this into context, one of the schools where I am chair happens to be a standalone trust. We're a rather large standalone trust. We're a 2,000 pupil school very nearly. And we had a visit from what we originally thought was going to be the Educational Skills Funding Agency, who, if you're not aware, they're the people that fund academies. This was back in February, I want to say now. I think it was just before February half term, in fact. When they turned up, they told us they were from the Department for Education. And interestingly, when they sent a letter of confirmation, it was actually from the Regional Schools Commissioner's Office, which still existed nowadays. So a little bit of confusion, but basically the thrust of the meeting, and this has been happening up and down the country in quite a lot of standalone trusts and some of the smaller multi-academy trusts, purporting to just be interested to find out about how things are going, but some very pointed questioning on what are your intentions for the future in terms of grouping with other schools, becoming a multi-academy trust, joining somebody else's, etc. Now, without getting on my soapbox here, the trust where I'm chair, we happen to be part of a collaboration at the moment that involves us as a standalone academy, one other standalone academy, a maintained secondary school, and a very small multi-academy trust of 2 schools. And within that collaboration, no money changes hands, but we believe we have all the benefits of a multi-academy trust without any of the costs. And of course, one of the things that we have to bear in mind, academisation, joining a multi-academy trust, there is some top slicing that goes on. So there is a cost to it. But nonetheless, the DFE, who eventually wrote to us and confirmed the meeting, very much wanted to emphasise what future plans were. So this is part of a journey that we're going on within education at the moment. And I think that we need to bear that in mind. There's an interesting question on the panel from Paul. Paul's actually saying, if local authorities can apply for an academy order, does this take the decision out of the hands of school governors and the head teacher? I don't think it does, Paul, and I'm sorry to say think rather than no. It's not clear at the moment. I think that point that I read out to you about it, the school doesn't have to follow a local authority. Schools will continue to have that right. Well, if it says schools have that right, it means that the governing body has that right. But quite how that will actually work in the fullness of time, we're not sure at this point in time. And I think we'll have to wait until regulations linked to the statute actually come out. Again, good point here coming from Saf, and Saf is actually saying, is this a bit like the original policy intent to encourage schools to become academies, part two, but in reality, no compulsion to do so? I'm not sure it is. I think there will be no legal compulsion to do so. However, and I think the however does actually represent quite a big question mark. It will depend on the powers. There are already some powers being talked about by the government in terms of schools that have two successive requires improvement judgments being forced into academisation, and of course all of the raft of measures that will be supported by the new standards that Linda mentioned a few moments ago, and I'm going to come on to in more detail in a few seconds. They give powers of intervention. Of course, those powers of intervention ultimately will mean that there could be more direction. Again, we don't know at this point in time, but that could actually be the situation.
I think the other side of that coin, also with the number of schools that will form part of this plan for academisation, it leaves a decreasing number of schools, and the smaller that number of schools becomes with the local authority, the more difficult it will be for the local authority to continue to support those schools. So that again isn't clear how that might work, but the role there, as you say, will change over time.
Absolutely. Couple of more questions relevant to this on the panel. Sue is asking, will the 55 local authorities, and these were the ones that were named in terms of education priority in the white paper, will they be required to look at academisation more quickly? I guess they will, but that again, that's not part of the bill. And interestingly, those 55 local authority areas are not even mentioned in the draft bill. So I think it remains to be seen. But I think, yes, Sue, you're absolutely right. The writing is actually on the wall there. And again, Paul's put a comment on: is there a huge shift? If there is a huge shift to academies, will there be local Department for Education offices at a smaller geographical area than a region to offer support and guidance and understand local issues? That's an interesting point. Again, we've got 9 regional offices at the moment, which actually just mirror what were in place for the Regional Schools Commissioners set up. But I'm minded that Linda and I were at a conference quite a few years ago now, when Estelle Morris was the she was no longer Secretary, but Estelle Morris, who was the Secretary of State in Tony Blair's government, she spoke at a conference when the Academies Bill had just been passed, probably in 2010 or 2011. And she was saying that when she was Secretary of State, the department had a couple of desks that actually dealt with academies, because it was actually a small part of the policy remit. At the time that she spoke to, she said that had now become the whole of the top floor of the Department for Education. And she was saying, but of course, the more that the academy movement actually gains momentum, the greater the amount of control that governments potentially would want. Then, of course, it'll get regionalised, and then ultimately you might split those regions down into smaller areas. And of course, she was saying this slightly with tongue in cheek, and maybe we might end up calling those local authorities. So there's an element of sort of full circle here. I think you're right, Paul. We do have to think about what that might look like. No mention in the bill, but I think it is fairly clear to see that there will be further control at local level at some point in time. And I think that will depend entirely on how smoothly this process goes. And of course, we can never lose sight of the fact that there's going to be a general election, come what may, in a couple of years' time. And that could change things completely. It might not, but it could. Okay, let's move on at that stage. We've got quite a few other bits and pieces to get through, if we may. I want to move on now, as I say, and just talk a little bit about the academy standards. And again, a lot of this is not absolutely spelled out in terms of what the government's actually planning. But if you look at the support documents here, and I'm not sure why that didn't, I don't know why I put this on as an, sorry. Okay, I'm not sure why I animated that. Sorry, that's my mistake in putting the thing together. But there is one of these fact sheets, as you can see, on Academy Trust Standards. It's quite a lengthy little tome, it has to be said. But if you are already in an academy, or even if you're in a maintained school and thinking about what the academy status might look like, this is probably the one that I would actually suggest is actually very well worthwhile actually looking for. As I say, it's a weighted tome. It's 27 pages in total. But what it doesn't give us is that precise direction as to what the standards will be. But what it does say is that the Secretary of State, and again, Linda made this point already, what the bill does is transfer huge swathes of power into the Office of the Secretary of State for Education. And that's one of the reasons why, certainly in the House of Lords at the moment, in the first and second reading of the bill, there's been quite a lot of opposition, because a lot of people think at the moment this tends to fly in the face of what previously has been Conservative Party policy of decentralization. What this bill represents is a lot of power being sucked into the centre and given to the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State will have the power, and again, this will not be in primary legislation, the Secretary of State will have the power to make regulations. And what the fact sheet tells us is that the and they're called indicative areas, the indicative areas of education, sorry, of the indicative areas of the standards, the areas that we might see regulations come in for, are, as you see on this bullet point list here. And I'm not going to read them all out to you, but of course, what you will see from all of these, going from the quality of education and curriculum provision, that was quite clearly linked to where we are from an Ofsted perspective at the moment. But of course, it also links into one of the drivers, as Linda said, for this, this bill and the white paper initially, was that the government has had Ofsted telling it for quite some time now that there are a number of independent schools, there are a number of free schools that have been set up, academies that are actually in operation, who have taken probably slightly greater advantage of the curriculum freedoms that were actually sold as part and parcel of the autonomy of academies, taken them to quite an extensive degree, and are operating outside a model that the government actually envisaged. So this is a way that the government will be able to actually control the curriculum to a far greater extent than is actually possible at the moment. And as Linda said, we've got that model right now, which is very much contractual, and the contract is the funding agreement, which is that basic agreement that sets up the Academy Trust. It's an agreement between the Department for Education and the school itself, or schools that are setting up the trust. And we will move to one where that takes second place to the statutory regulations that are in place that govern how all academies work. Again, going into the personal development side through welfare, health, safety, attendance, etc. And I think I'd just say that on attendance, we have already seen a lot of movement. There's a huge section on the Department for Education website on attendance at the moment, including some quite interesting videos. And I'm choosing my words carefully, but in interesting videos in terms of things that we might want to know as governors about what government's future plans, but more importantly, what their future expectations of schools are in terms of how they monitor that. Spiritual, moral, social, careers, guidance, etc. Again, other areas linked to the curriculum, of course, no big surprises there. And if you put that together with assessment, you will see that clearly that is something that you know, the government is actually moving on really a model of tightening the control a little bit, I think, to say the least. Interesting, the length of the school day term, etc. That was one of the key advantages or freedoms that the Academies Bill in 2010, sorry, the Academies Act in 2010 sold to schools as one of the real compulsions on why it's a good idea to become an academy. Lots have taken advantage of that. Interestingly, we've already had advance notice that by September next year, 2023, all schools must offer a minimum of 32.5 hours a week. Lots of schools already do, but some don't. Now, that's done through regulation already, but what we will potentially see here is that where we have some schools who might be offering the 32.5 hours a week, instead of the 39 weeks a year, which is mandatory for maintained schools, some academies don't have anywhere near that at the moment. Some trusts are taking up to 3 additional weeks a year, making it up, they're claiming, by an extra 10 minutes or half an hour, whatever it might be at lunchtime. So I think we will see more regulation there as we come through. And something that's quite close to Linda's and my hearts, we've got spent, I think we've had 2 webinars this week already for the schools that we support, looking at the role of governance in complaint, and also the support that clerks for dealing with complaints. We have different models in academies to those that we have in the maintained sector at the moment. And it's very clear from reading the fact sheet that the government wants to actually align the two. So again, some of those things that were sold as freedoms initially into the academy sector, not necessarily going to continue into the future. And sorry, Linda.
With all schools being under the same banner, the expectation that all are in a trust, there is an expectation by parents, rightly so, that if their child is in a state-funded organisation, there will be some similarities between the way some of these things are managed. Complaints, admissions, those are, areas where parents get confused very easily if things are very different. So this standardization, as well as high standards, I think we do need to think of that word meaning both things.
Absolutely agree, Linda. And again, if you look at this second list here, this is just a continuation. Clearly, what this really is saying is there is a vast number of areas here that the DfE is thinking that the Secretary of State will be minded to intervene in. And again, you look at the ones down the sort of second half of this list relating staff appointments, staff remuneration. I think one of the frustrations has been the freedom to ignore the school teachers pay and conditions document is one of those basic freedoms that academies had. That's something that's caused some concern in the department, but an area that has caused far greater concern is the fact that salary levels, remuneration levels for some of the most senior leaders in some multi-academy trusts have been exorbitant, in using the words of the department. There are some trust leaders, of course, who are earning significantly more than the Prime Minister. Now, don't want to get into that particular debate, but that was actually used as a bit of a benchmark historically, for I'm not sure what reason that might be. It's not been used very much recently in terms of the worth of that, but it is something that we do need to actually think about. That is a responsibility of governance, of course, but it might be one that we see again whittled away in the future with regulation. And I think what that says to us, of course, in terms of the implications for us as governors of all of these standards, or these potential areas, because again, don't forget that this is not a definitive list of this is what we plan to do. But nobody writes the list without some kind of intention behind it, would be my assertion here. So these are Linda's and my thoughts represented on this slide here. But I mean, certainly without any doubt, and again, just following on from what Linda's just said, what this actually represents, of course, is that tightening, and this is a phrase that the government have used quite often, tightening of all, tightening of academy autonomy. Now, there's a bit of a pedant in me that says that's not a terribly helpful phrase because it's actually meaningless. If you're autonomous, how can you tighten that autonomy? I think what we have is a government that has actually been on a quest for quite some time now for alignment. And I think what they want to do is have a picture of the education landscape where all academies, and in their world, they would wish all schools to be part of the academy system, but we've talked about that already, but where all schools are operating under the same rules, the same principles. And of course, the reality is that there are extensive additional powers being given to the Secretary of State, potentially by this bill, if it does receive statute in its current form, and that makes that a very real possibility. What it will do, of course, is mean that regardless of the fact that, the government intention in terms of everybody being part of a strong multi-academy trust, as they call it, that being an intention for 2030, sorry. What it does mean is in the intervening period, we are very likely to see more and more coming together of the regulatory framework for maintained schools and for the academy system, which means that, of course, the key driver behind all of this, as I've already said, is that quest that the government wants for alignment. And of course, we've got to realise that, this is about a quest for efficiency more than anything else on their part. If you have one model that applies to everybody, that's easier to administer, it makes the life of the department more simple. And of course, that fits into another area of government policy, and the DfE is not immune from this current government's commitment to reduce the number of civil servants, of course. Okay, so let's move on to the second part of the bill. As Linda said at the beginning, we're not going to spend as much time on these, primarily because we judged that it would be the academies area that you would be most interested in, but also because there isn't as much to say on these other areas. Many of them are perhaps putting into legislation or into planned legislation what we already knew was coming, or are just extending the reach of existing legislation. First one is national funding formula. Many of you who've been governors for some time will, of course, recall that this was initially called the fair funding formula. I'm not sure where that word fair has gone. That may tell us something about it, I guess. Applies to England only, and I'm very aware that through the Governors for Schools networks, we do have colleagues from Wales certainly joining us. So if you are a governor in a Welsh school, this does not apply to you. This is for England only. Obviously, the Welsh system is funded in a very different way. I think the interesting thing to say is here, given that the main push for the whole draft bill is about academies, what this is saying is that under this national funding formula, maintained schools funding will still be channeled via the local authority, and actually the local authority itself will still have some say in how funding streams, probably most pointedly the higher needs funding block, in other words, the support for special needs, that will have some scope for local intervention in. The local authorities will be subject to greater regulation by the Secretary of State, but the powers that they're talking about giving the Secretary of State are unspecified in the bill so far. They're mentioned in the fact sheet, which I've got a snapshot on the left-hand side of the screen there, but it doesn't go into details. But it does say that any local determination of spending plans, the Secretary of State will have powers to actually intervene there. Interestingly, Schools Forum, if you're not familiar with Schools Forum, every local authority in the country has to have a Schools Forum. It's a consultative forum, and it's a coming together of the local authority finance team and the leadership of the local authorities education team, of course, with all other parties. And academies actually have places on those school forum as well as maintained schools, and they make decisions. They're actually consulted on, and very often make decisions about how allocations of funding are actually decided within individual areas. So again, there's another watch and wait. There's no specified details here in terms of what that formula is actually going to look like. But of course, this has been talked about for at least 5, if not 6 years now. Linda's already mentioned attendance. This is the part 3 of the bill. What we have here is 2 specific areas of it, really. One is relating to, again, something that probably it's not come about because of the pandemic, but it's certainly, I think, been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic and during the pandemic. And that's the idea of, well, not the idea, sorry, that is the reality that a large number of children have actually disappeared out of the school system. Many are being home educated at their parents' choice, their parents' wishes. Others, there are some question marks as to why then they haven't returned to schools, etc. But there has been a concern, and so what the government are doing, under pressure again from Ofsted and other children's charities, NSPCC, Barnardo's, etc., are planning to create a new duty, and most of the regulations regarding attendance in schools are still sitting in the 1996 Education Act, so it goes back quite a long way, but nonetheless that's the primary legislation here. So the Act is planning an amendment to the 1996 the draft bill is planning an amendment to the 1996 Act, and basically that amendment will make it a requirement for local authorities to hold a register of children not in school. So we have registers, of course, very detailed registers and requirements for all children who are in schools, all state-funded schools, so academies and maintained schools. But at the moment, the local authority doesn't really have any power other than under a safeguarding duty for those children who are home educated, officially home educated, or those who are sort of not actually in the system. And there will be powers under this new amendment as well, which give local authorities basically the right to direct parents to send their children to school. So the reason I've put that in italics on that next bullet point, preliminary notice for school attendance order, that's what it's going to be called, or certainly that's the intention at the moment, for those where the authority under its greater powers does not believe that home education is actually meeting the needs for their children, or where parents are just refusing to send their children to school, which is the case in some areas of the country, because of concerns either for children's health and welfare because of COVID, or possibly because of anxiety related to that on the part of the parents and carers themselves. There is going to be a specific notice to attend for some children with education, some children, young people with education and healthcare plans, where the authorities are mind that their needs cannot be met in a home environment. And again, all of those are covered in that, the top fact sheet there, children not in school. And then there's also a general school attendance one, and there's nothing particularly new in that. I mean, it's very much about reiteration of existing government policy in many ways. It's actually consolidating that into legislation, gives the Secretary of State, of course, further regulatory power to compel schools to act in certain ways. But most of it is actually about strengthening of schools' attendance policies where it's actually felt to be appropriate. Greater intervention in academies, where at the moment the local authority does not have the same powers of intervention in terms of educational welfare or inclusion, and really bringing what we've already seen. And again, this started last year. We've had new guidance, and that new guidance is very much actually stressing the importance of fixed penalty notices being used on a more frequent level and actually being insisted on being used. And that's really what this strand of the bill is actually all about.
I think it's worth saying, just before we move on from that, the register is all designed to be supported with local authority staff who can provide that kind of level of support for children as well. So it's not divorced entirely from, this is all about just making sure children attend a school, and we have a register of those who are not. For those who are home educated or in a different arrangement than in a publicly funded school, there is that expectation that those children will not be forgotten, and there will be some kind of way of keeping a note of who those children are and where they're being educated.
Absolutely, and there is a big driver on welfare generally, but obviously specifically safeguarding here as well, of course, and we shouldn't overlook that. A question from Deborah on the panel at the moment: will this new register include those children that are still on roll at a school but not attending? Absolutely, it will. And of course, there are very specific rules with regard to maintained schools about removing children and young people off roll. There are schools in the country at the moment that still have quite large numbers of youngsters off roll that haven't been in school for quite some time. So the idea is that the local authority will now have a statutory duty to monitor that, and as Linda says, intervene, not just in terms of actually forcing them to go to school, but intervene in terms of conducting those welfare checks, ensuring that those children are being fully and effectively safeguarded. Okay, so let's move on to part 4 is the section that relates to independent education institutions. Now, this is a fairly broad sector because, of course, this really relates to all independent providers outside of the state-funded system. So although academies are very often referred to as part of the independent sector, they are not independently funded. So this is all other providers, and of course this might actually include some of the alternative provision providers and a few others in that. Now, on this area, there are 5 specific fact sheets which relate to a whole variety of different aspects of, if you like, education, safeguarding, etc., within the independent sector. They are all really emanating out of concerns that central government has relating to the activities of some of them. And we've heard in the media as a result of Ofsted inspections in some of these schools in the past, but also the fact that Ofsted are not eligible to enter all of them. Ofsted have actually raised concerns, A, about the quality of the curriculum, but sometimes and often more routinely seen potential breaches of equalities legislation. And there are a whole variety of non-state funded schools, and let's say some of those have been highlighted by Ofsted. And what these proposals in the draft bill do is actually give the Department for Education basically initially the powers to intervene, but then also from that the ability to enact certain measures, including registration requirements here, investigation powers, and everything else that we see. So, again, as Linda said at the beginning, if you're interested, perhaps through your role as a governor in looking at these, then the links are out, or the link for all of these are all on the same part of the website is there at the end of the session, which you can use if you wish. And then the last one is the miscellaneous section. Now, it's interesting, it's called miscellaneous, but the only element that's in there at the moment is teacher regulation. Interesting, in the bill, the section, or the part 5 is called it's called miscellany, and then under that, teacher regulation. But when you look at the fact sheet, the sheet itself is actually called teacher misconduct. Only one that's there in this section at the moment. That doesn't mean it will stay the only one, of course. But in essence, what this is saying is that the bill is proposing to extend all of the current regulations relating to teacher misconduct and the regulation of teacher conduct in schools. It's going to extend that beyond state-funded schools at the moment to include independent educational institutions in England, so all independent schools, FE further education providers. There are some specific post-16 institutions in this country that provide independent training, mainly for special educational needs pupils, but not exclusively. And of course, then there are a whole raft of other providers, including alternative provision providers. And in essence, what the bill's going to do is to actually bring all of those together. And again, this is, as much as anything else, it's a safeguarding measure so that children, young people in this country are protected by the same regulations about the staff who are actually supervising and teaching them on a day-to-day basis. So again, not particularly contentious, that one at all, I would suggest. Just wanted to draw your attention before we finished today. We've got one other slide after this one. This is a slide, and those of you that attended the session that Linda and I did for Governors for Schools last month on the white paper, this was a slide we used there, and I just wanted to draw your attention to this one, that this was the headline slide in many ways. 2030, all children benefit from being taught in a family of schools, etc. We've talked that already. And then there were these 3 bullet points that came out of that. Well, the reality is none of these are actually in the school bill. Now, I know a couple of you have actually mentioned these this morning already, but just wanted to say the schools bill is not a panacea to everything in the white paper without any doubt whatsoever. We still have government policy. And I think we're in a situation now, which we've probably been in since the coalition government back in 2010, 2011, where there were certain things that were brought in as, if you like, a conservative government's policy, but policy that is not legislated. So, for example, everything around the EBAC in secondary schools, the English Baccalaureate, that is not part of a statutory framework. However, because the Department of Education has made it its stated policy, we have seen a lot of pressure, not least of all, of course, coming from Ofsted. And I think what we will see is that kind of approach more and more commonly used by the department through its regional directors and through obviously Ofsted, which is one of the government agencies as well. And then we just wanted to finish really by thinking about the implications of all of this, but I guess specifically on the academies element of the schools bill for us as governors in our schools, whether they be maintained schools or within the academy sector. And I think the first point that we would make, and again, this is a reiteration of what we said last month as well, 2030 is still a long way off, both in terms of education and certainly in terms of politics. And therefore, I think this is no time for knee-jerk reaction or anybody to think, oh goodness, whose multi-academy trust are we going to join? That's not what's being called for at the moment. I think we need to observe as governors the passage of this bill through Parliament. The debate goes on. It's not a foregone conclusion. It will go through in its current form at all. I'll come back to that in just a few moments. But I think one of the calls to action for me, for all governing boards at the moment, and there are implications for everybody in state-funded education. So whether you're a maintained school, whether you're a standalone academy, or whether you're perhaps a multi-academy trust that's not of a particularly large size, or even if you're a big one, there are implications for all of us in this bill, and I think we should be discussing it. So your governing body or your board should have a discussion, and I think it's a really good thing to actually reflect on. Yeah, have we already had it? Are we going to have another one about what the long-term plan might be for our school? And of course, part of that has to be thinking about structure. Now, the one thing I would say, of course, is that what we shouldn't do is spend the next 8 years navel gazing about what the future structure of our school might look like, because actually the reality is our role as governors is all about pupil outcomes. What we should be doing is focusing on the day-to-day job, about providing the best possible learning and the best possible care for our youngsters, and focusing on structural issues ain't the way to do that in my view at all. I think the debate will continue, there's no doubt about that. We've already seen the Local Government Association produce some research opposing the government's assertion about academies being a better route than maintained schools. The National Association of Head Teachers has come out very strongly in opposition to the government's proposals, and we've even seen opposition in the House of Lords last week by Lord Baker, Kenneth Baker as was, and of course he is another former Secretary of State of Education, and his main objections are about the raft of powers and the increased centralisation that this bill represents for education, which has never been Tory party policy in the past. So we're in a situation which is certainly contentious. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. It's one that does have implications for us as governors, but it's one that, again, my closing thought I'd just like to leave with you is don't panic, don't knee-jerk. Careful consideration of what the future holds and what that means for us is the order of the day. And that's all that Linda and I wanted to share with you. I'm sorry, we're a minute or two over. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for all of those questions that have actually come in. We will go back and look at the question panel. If there are any questions that we don't feel that we've answered specifically during the session, then we'll get back to you electronically with those. But as I mentioned, we've actually got there the URLs for the white paper itself, the schools bill, and all of those policy statements. So every single one of those policy statements, all 16, you can find on that last URL there. And that just leaves us to say thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next time. We've got a webinar coming up next month focusing on the new version of Keeping Children Safe in Education, which we're again thrilled to be supporting Governors for Schools in delivering that. It's a lovely day where I am. I hope it is where you are too. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.